Good afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
We are here with Guy Lasnier. It is the 2nd of October 2019 at the Scotts Valley Library, and we're here to talk about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Thank you for being here.
You bet. My pleasure.
Can you start by telling me how long you've been in Santa Cruz?
I've been in Santa Cruz for almost 50 years. I lived as a little kid in Brookdale and went to kindergarten in Boulder Creek and first grade in Felton. Then we moved up to Marin County, Tam Valley, and then I came back down in 1975 to go to UCSC, and I've been pretty much here ever since. So that's about 44 years, the last stint. 4 years plus 44 years.
Cool. So what were you doing during the earthquake?
Well, I was a reporter for the Santa Cruz Sentinel. I was a city reporter. I was in their main office on Church Street on the phone with somebody who lived in Live Oak, and I was confirming an obituary. We would write up obituaries in those days, and then we'd call the family to go over the facts and make sure that we had it straight. So I was on the phone at 5:04 p.m. on a Tuesday, as I recall, and October 17th, and suddenly the woman I was talking to says, oh, we're having an earthquake, and I felt nothing, and then within about 4 or 5 seconds, it was just bam, 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 and the whole building was shaking and everything rocking up and down. The lights went out, the overhead lights crashed down to the floor, and the woman I was talking to said, "I've got to go," and she left, and so I was on the phone, and then I crawled under my desk, and it was a sturdy steel case desk, so I was fine.
So what happened after that?
So as I said, the lights went out, everything sort of came to a stop after about, I don't know what it was, 10, 12, 15 seconds, maybe longer, sort of crawled out from where people had taken shelter, went outside into the parking lot and kind of regrouped. Peggy Townsend was the city editor at the time, and she said, "Okay, we've got to get to work. We got to cover this." And she started assigning people to things. I was the city reporter, and I assumed that I would be staying in Santa Cruz, but she sent me up to San Lorenzo Valley and Zayante. So Shmuel Thaler, who's a super photographer, he and I jumped in my car, I believe, and yeah, it was my car, and went over to his house on Capitola Road Extension because he didn't have all his camera gear with him. So we drove across town, and by that point, traffic was pretty bad because of lights were out. And I remember very clearly going by Shoppers Corner and seeing people kind of bandaged and bloodied because of broken glass and windows and things. And it was the classic thing, you think that this is like a movie. Mm-hmm. But anyway, we made it across town. It was pretty bad traffic. Got to his place, got his camera gear, and then the freeway was all messed up, so we kind of went a back way, the wrong way, on, I forget the name of the street, but it gets into the De La Viega, Prospect Heights area, and basically got going. I think we went up Graham Hill Road, and then we just headed up into the San Lorenzo Valley, talking to people and taking pictures, headed up into Zayante and Lompico, where there was a lot of damage, a lot of houses had collapsed, and just reporting, taking pictures and talking to folks and assessing the damage. Went into Zayante Fire, I think, and I hadn't been in contact with my family. I was living in Freedom, just outside Watsonville at the time. I had a 6.5-year-old wife who was pregnant, and then her brother was coming over for the baseball game. We were going to go. I was going to finish up my shift and then go down and watch the World Series because it was the Giants and the A's, and my son was a big fan. It was a big deal, the Bay Bridge series. But I hadn't been in touch with them for several hours because of this. So we went into Zayante Fire, and they had either a phone line or a radio or something. I was able to get through to them and say, I'm okay, how are you guys doing, that kind of thing. And then we just continued on. It was dark, and I forget exactly how we ended up wrapping it up. We basically decided, well, we're sort of done, and I don't remember if we went back to the paper or just sort of headed home, but I got home, probably after midnight or something, and we were set up a tent in the backyard and sleeping on the back lawn because things were just a mess in the house and we weren't quite sure what was going to happen. The thing I remember about that was just the aftershock. So we'd be sleeping on the ground and then, an aftershock would come through and disturb you, obviously.
Yeah. Do you have any anecdotes from interviewing people immediately after the earthquake? When you were in the valley?
I don't. I mean, what I remember is people sort of wandering around. And there was one guy who used to work at the Sentinel who lived up there. We happened to run into him. He's since gotten a job at the Mercury News. And he was kind of just wandering around barefoot. I remember a house kind of collapsed and there was a board game called The Game of Life. And I pointed it out to Shmuel and he took a photograph of that. The conversations I had with people, I was going to review my notes and all, but I haven't. Conversations I don't really remember anymore. Mostly people were pretty shocked and not sure what to do next. The next morning, I forget how, we must have had phone service. The next morning we went into work and the paper wasn't functioning. The presses were knocked offline. But we had little, we called them Trash 80s. They were Radio Shack TRS-80 computers. I mean, they're laughable today, but that's what we composed stories on when we weren't in the office. So there's pictures, photographs that I remember of people sitting on the ground. I remember there's one of me sitting sort of spread-legged typing on one of these little things. And so we basically wrote up our stories based on what we'd seen and sent them into over phone lines to the Mercury News, and then a crew from the Sentinel went. You couldn't go over 17, so they went around via Gilroy to San Jose, and San Jose helped us put together a newspaper. So we had a paper that came out. We didn't miss a publication. The Sentinel came out the afternoon of the 18th, I guess it would be. Because on the 17th, we would have been working on the paper for the 18th because it was a morning paper, but we didn't get out in that morning, but we had one in, that afternoon. And at that point, we started to decide, how we were going to cover things. Downtown was completely a mess and things were blocked off and fenced off. I don't remember exactly the first few days, but we kind of renewed our roles. I was the city reporter, so I started talking to the police and city council people about sort of what the next steps were. We missed, I think there are 3 papers, 2 or 3 issues that were printed by the Mercury News because we weren't able to, and then we were finally able to do an ig. And I think the first one we had, I could be wrong about this, we can check the archives, but bigwigs came, Panetta was there and Marty Wormhat was the mayor, and you see people, Duke Magian, and I think, I have to look, I forget now if George H.W. Bush came to town, and there's pictures of them walking along Lincoln Street where the whole wall of building had fallen off. My wife used to work in that building as a graphic artist, but wasn't there that day.
Luckily. Did you understand the significance of the earthquake when it was happening?
Not when it was happening, but shortly thereafter, I think we realized it was a big deal and that things wouldn't be the same. It wasn't clear exactly what was going to happen, but that it really was a big deal and profoundly affected things. I mean, FEMA people came in, and I did stories with them, with families, lining up to talk to them. The big thing I remember is within about a week, I was back in the office. Our office was open, and the newsroom was on the ground floor at the Sentinel at that time. And Mark Premack and William Rule sort of marched in with this idea, and Harriet Deck was part of it. She was a realtor downtown. They were going to, they were talking about, we call them pavilions, but these big tents that they had seen someplace, and they were going to arrange to set up these pavilions and then displaced businesses could occupy those in order to keep in business, because most of the businesses had been wrecked, and you couldn't even get downtown. You couldn't go along Pacific Avenue anymore. The Cooper House, of course, was out. Bookshop Santa Cruz was out. Most of the other businesses were too. And that's ultimately what happened. I forget now exactly how long that took. It was pretty quick, though, and there was a big, there was one big day when I used to work at Bookshop Santa Cruz, and so I know Neil Cunity pretty well. And there was one day where he had people, he could go in and retrieve books, and they moved everything out, and it was kind of a major effort because they could only be in there for so many minutes at a time. But they were able to get the stock and then stock a pavilion. He also did a thing where people would bring used books down and help fill his shelves in order for that business to keep going. And then there were 2 or 3 more of these pavilions, these temporary structures, kind of like what the Kaiser Arena is now, although on a smaller scale, where businesses could set up. And there were varying levels of success. Some were more successful than others, but it was a way of keeping some commerce going.
Right. Did the earthquake impact your life, and if so, how?
Well, it did. I mean, it's a cliche to say, but it did literally shake things up, both for the family as well as for the town, I think. It didn't. I know people who left town, who moved to Seattle and moved to Portland. There was a guy who worked at the Good Times, and he just up and moved and got a job on the Seattle Times, as I remember, because I knew somebody up there. Some people were scared and they wanted to just get out of Dodge. Other people kind of knuckled down and wanted to renew things. I don't know that it affected my life particularly. It was a busy period of time, and kind of as a news person, it was a big story, and reporters love big stories. So that was interesting. And the thing I noticed is that Santa Cruz politics has always been fractious. It's been fractious for a long time, since mid-'60s, late 60s, when things started to change some. And it was that time. I don't remember exactly who was on the city council, but there were the battles between the old guard and the new guard. My recollection is, and it may be a little sanguine these days, but is that people had a common purpose, and they wanted to work together. And Vision Santa Cruz was started, which was to literally envision what the new Santa Cruz would be like. The old one was gone. The Pacific Garden Mall with the windy street and no parking that wasn't going to happen anymore. So there were all these meetings about what the new way of doing things would be like. It worked out pretty well, I think, for a while, and then people, I think, got complacent, and now they're fighting again over things. But I think that's one thing that really came from it, is it, again, to use that phrase, shook people up to rethink about what they were doing in town and getting along.
Did you see it impact the Santa Cruz community in any way?
Well, I think it did. I think it made people realize what they had in common rather than what divided them, which was one thing that was good that came of it. I think it made people question how things used to be done and try to look ahead some. In terms of public safety and earthquake preparedness, it was on the top of people's minds for a while. I think that's probably faded. I have a rudimentary emergency kit, but I don't have a good one or a complete one. I've got some water and some food and things, but I haven't really put something together. I think that could be done better, because we know it's going to happen again at some point.
Sure. What is it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
Well, it's interesting. It's really hard to believe it's been that long. It's for people who were there before. There's before the earthquake and after the earthquake. And I was talking to someone the other day. I was getting some photographs from Bay Photo for another project, and Seal Cirillo came in and I said hi to her. Seal Cirillo was hired as the redevelopment director about a year afterwards. She came from Long Beach area, Signal Hill, and I know her. I wrote the first story about that she was coming. She always reminds me how I was the first one to call her up when Signal Hill when she was coming up, and she was key to helping move things along using redevelopment funds and redevelopment agency. I've lost my train of thought there, but ask me the question again.
Reflecting on your experience.
Oh, okay. So anyway, that's right. So there's before the earthquake and after the earthquake, and it was such a big deal. And then as time goes on, you kind of remember, oh, it's been 5 years. Oh, it's been 10 years. Oh, it's been. Anyway, so I was working with a young woman at Bay Photo on this other project, and Seal came over and we were talking, and I said to this woman, you know, that was Seal Cirillo and who she was and what a big deal was about the earthquake. And I said, and that happened before you were born, right? And she goes, yep, yes, it did. So it's just, there's a whole generation, couple of generations who, you know, that was something long ago. And for us, it was a kind of a seminal moment in our lives. My wife was pregnant at the time. My daughter was born 7 months later, so she was after the earthquake. She has some friends who she went to SoCal High with who were born the day after the earthquake or the day of the earthquake, so they're that same year, so they're kind of earthquake babies in a way. But that's the big thing. It's the fact that amount of time, 30 years has passed, is interesting to me, and there's a whole group of people who know about it but didn't experience it because it was affected. 17 was, I didn't have to go over 17 at the time. I later worked for the Mercury News and did, but 17 was closed for 2.5 or 3 weeks or something because of a big slide, and it just affected. Santa Cruz was pretty isolated for a while there. Both the coast, I think, was closed, and you could get around over Hecker Pass, but it was it was a big deal, and it's kind of faded a little bit now, but it was still a big deal at the time.
What does the earthquake mean to you?
Well, it's sort of the fragility of our existence here. I mean, the earthquakes, tidal waves, hurricanes are mammoth natural events that make us look very, very tiny in comparison. I was on the coast after the Fukushima quake and stood at Cowles and watched the water go way out farther than I'd ever seen it go before and then come in, and it wasn't a mammoth wave or anything, but it came in like a river, and you just realize that there are these forces that are beyond our comprehension, really, and an earthquake is in that same way, and I think hurricanes are in that same way, tidal waves are, mammoth tidal waves are in the same thing. So it means, that we're just, our existence here is pretty puny, and we sort of make the best as we can.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, I think we've covered it a lot. I was going to look at my clips and refresh my memory a little bit, and I didn't, so I'm a failure there. But you have the archives. The library has excellent archives, and I think the Sentinel did really good work in that period of time, covering a lot of that. There are so many things I remember. I think he was a police chief from South Carolina who came in. Hurricane Hugo had really damaged the South Carolina coast just before the earthquake, and they were in really bad shape. But this police chief came marching in with some folks to help, and I remember him strutting down the street with his guys and stuff. So there was a lot of attention was paid to Santa Cruz. My friend who used to be a reporter on the both the Pajaronian and the Sentinel sat next to Mick Jagger on a bus when he came to town to do things. Crosby, Stills, and Nash did I think Ann Young, who had previously lived in the not Santa Cruz area, but he played here in the 70s before the earthquake. But they did a special concert. There were benefit concerts, and I did one story where they were, I think, going to play at the Catalyst, and tickets sold out really fast, and I had done a story, I think I said they sold out in 12 seconds or something. Well, it turns out that was wrong, and we had to make a correction, but somebody had told me that. But there was a lot of attention paid, and people people really did band together, and it's something I think people have forgotten. They did band together and have a common objective.
I just want to circle back real quick.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you didn't know the significance of the earthquake when it happened, but eventually you came to understand that it was a pretty significant thing. Was there a watershed moment or some epiphany that you had that made you realize how destructive and how massive it was?
Yeah, I think it didn't take long. I think it was the next day or two when Pacific Avenue was completely blocked off by chain link fencing, and there were law enforcement from all over the place keeping people out. I had a friend who had a little restaurant in the Cooper House, who was also a newsman. He was a radio newsman, and they operated it was bento box, Japanese lunches, and they were unable to get into the Cooper House to literally get their money out of it and stuff too. So there were a lot of things you just couldn't do. So I think that the significance, and just seeing the rubble and the damage, the significance was there. After a while, I went through all the property records and noted who owned what up and down all 4 blocks, both sides of Pacific Avenue, just to see what happened with those properties. Times I left the Sentinel in '94, and different reporters came and went, and so nothing ever came of that, and I don't have those notes anymore. But there was an awareness that things were going to change. I was interested in who was going to be owning property and how that whole Pacific Avenue thing would work. A couple of big things. I remember Joe Cucchiera, who was a supervisor from San Lorenzo Valley. He might have since left, but he helped. A couple of the key things that really brought people downtown again were the movie theaters. That movie theater, which the name escapes me, but it really was a draw and it brought people downtown. That was one of the first big things. And then I'll give one shout out to John Livingston, the owner of Logos Books and Records. He was the first guy to rebuild, and he, as I remember, was the first guy to really rebuild and reopen on Pacific Avenue. And times changing tastes and the internet and things affected that business in the long run, 30 years later or 29 years later. But he really did a great job and got up and running. So there were little pockets of people who made things happen. It's interesting if you look back and see, a lot of it's mushed together, because 5 years is a long period of time when you're living it year by year, but when you look back, it's not that long.
And you mentioned the Cooper House. Do you want to speak a little bit more about Cooper House?
I wrote a story about when they tore it down. I was standing on the parking garage opposite there, and there's a guy named Jay Paul who bought the Cooper House and was in the process of retrofitting it and rehabbing it. And there are many who argue that it could have been saved, that didn't need to be torn down, but judgments were made, and people were making decisions pretty fast, and there was kind of I think some things were done too quickly, but also you couldn't just sit around and twiddle your thumbs. You had to decide and move forward, because otherwise nothing would get done. So I remember very clearly when the big swinging ball hit the Cooper House, and it kind of bounced off, and there was a big cheer, the Cooper House is fighting back. So that was interesting. I don't have a judgment of whether it should have come down or not, but people had to decide and had to choose. It was an icon for the town, and that little restaurant area and warmth would play. I used to work for the Santa Cruz Independent, which was an alternative newspaper, and our offices were right across Pacific Avenue upstairs, right where the Rittenhouse building is now. And so we'd look out over the Cooper House on a Friday afternoon and hear the bands playing and watch people dancing and Rainbow Lady dancing and things like that. So it really was an icon of the sort of old Santa Cruz, or Santa Cruz of the the 70s, I would guess, 70s and 80s. So yeah, it's gone too bad. Things move on though, and I think the whole Abbott Square thing that's developed since then is a terrific, not improvement, but it's something different, but it's something new, and that's great.
Great. Well, if there isn't anything else that you would like to add, I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us.
Well, thanks for making the time and doing it. It's a great project. Thank you.
Thanks.